is still a profoundly moving statement of our values. It has never been more relevant than it is now.
The announcement did not arrive through a speech, a balcony appearance, or a carefully staged royal ceremony. It came through a sealed document placed before a handful of senior courtiers behind closed doors. When King Charles finally spoke, every person in the room understood that something deeply personal had become an act of royal power. William alone would inherit Queen Elizabeth's private correspondence, and the consequences would reach far beyond a collection of letters. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles sat at the head of the table as the doors of Buckingham Palace closed behind the final advisor. William remained opposite him, Camilla nearby, while the keeper of the royal archives placed a red leather file between them. The royal archives are the institution responsible for preserving the monarchy's official and private historical records, but this file carried material far more personal than ordinary state papers. Two constitutional advisors watched as the king opened the document and confirmed the decision without hesitation. Prince William would become the sole royal heir and custodian of Queen Elizabeth II's private correspondence. No other family member would receive equal ownership, independent access, or authority over the collection. The letters included handwritten reflections, private family messages, sealed communications, and deeply personal judgments never intended for immediate release. Their importance rested not only in what they recorded, but in what they could one day reveal about royal marriages, bitter disputes, political fears, succession anxieties, and the late monarch's private opinions of those closest to her. Whoever controlled access would also control how her voice entered history. William did not celebrate. He pressed his thumb against the edge of the document and asked whether the ruling was final. Charles answered that it was. The prince understood that he was inheriting more than royal property. He was being trusted with the intimate thoughts of the grandmother, who had helped shape his sense of duty. Camilla remained still, until one line forced her to speak. She asked whether the Queen's correspondence with Charles would also fall under William's control. The monarch gave a single measured nod. Her expression hardened, because private chapters of her life could now rest in the hands of the future king. Then the archivist revealed a restricted category of letters, marked with Elizabeth's personal cipher, a private royal symbol used to identify documents written or approved by the sovereign. A handwritten instruction declared that the material could be opened only after the monarch's death, and only by the person chosen to protect the continuity of the crown. Charles had named William. As the meeting ended, the prince left carrying the red file, while Camilla stayed seated in silence. The king noticed, but he did not follow her. But before the palace could understand why Charles had chosen William alone, it first had to confront what each person in that room stood to gain, protect, or lose. To the public, the decision appeared to be about inheritance. Inside the family, it was about trust. Charles was handing his eldest son the unfiltered memory of the woman who had shaped them both, while Camilla was being told that some doors would remain closed even to the queen beside him. William had received an extraordinary privilege, but with it came the power to uncover truths that could permanently alter how the family understood its own past. The king knew better than anyone how complicated that past had become. His bond with Queen Elizabeth had been built on deep respect, but also on restraint, disappointment, and decades of waiting beneath the authority of a mother who rarely spoke her private judgments aloud. He had inherited the crown only after spending most of his life wondering what she truly believed about his choices. William carried a different connection. His grandmother had steadied him after Diana's death, guided him toward kingship, and treated him as the bridge between the monarchy she inherited and the institution she hoped would survive. Yet that closeness made the red file more dangerous, not less. At Kensington Palace, the prince placed it on a desk and did not open it. Catherine watched him remove his glasses and rub his eyes, before he admitted that preserving Elizabeth's voice might be easier than discovering what she had thought during the family's most painful years. The archive, the protected collection where royal records are preserved, now held answers he was not certain he wanted. Charles faced the same fear alone later that evening. He studied a photograph of his mother beside his correspondence box and understood that his son might one day read letters written during the collapse of his marriage to Diana, the controversy surrounding Camilla, and the years when mother and son struggled to understand one another. The monarch had granted access, but he had also surrendered control over how his own history might be judged. Camilla's concern sharpened in private. She asked a trusted aide whether the collection included letters exchanged between Elizabeth and senior courtiers before her marriage to Charles. The aide could not answer. The queen consort feared more than embarrassment. She feared written proof that the late monarch had once resisted her acceptance far more strongly than the public ever knew. Catherine became William's safeguard. She urged him not to read as a wounded son or protective husband, but as a future king. Private truth, she warned, becomes dangerous when anger decides its meaning. Her words calmed him, yet they also confirmed what both already sensed. The letters could contain something explosive. Then Anne received a short briefing, stating that she had no independent claim to her mother's correspondence. The Princess Royal read it twice, folded it carefully, and requested an immediate meeting with Charles. Anne's reaction would expose that the decision had not begun with a legal document at all, but with a single private incident the palace had tried to bury. Months before Charles signed the order, one forgotten object forced the palace to face a question it had carefully avoided since Queen Elizabeth's death. A small red dispatch box, believed to contain routine personal papers, was opened during a private inventory at Windsor. Inside was not a collection of ceremonial notes, but a handwritten instruction from the late Queen herself. Its language was brief, deliberate, and impossible for Charles to ignore. The cataloging had moved slowly, because Elizabeth's private papers were scattered across Windsor, Balmoral, and Buckingham Palace. Archivists separated personal journals, family letters, annotated speeches, and handwritten notes from official state records. A dispatch box was a secure case traditionally used to carry important royal documents. But this one had remained sealed beneath her personal cipher, the private symbol identifying material connected directly to the sovereign. Different expectations had already formed inside the family. Anne assumed that letters written as a mother would eventually be shared among Elizabeth's children. Charles considered a controlled arrangement, while advisors proposed dividing correspondence according to its recipient. William expected no special authority and remained outside every discussion. Then the late evening inventory changed everything. An archivist opened the red box inside the former monarch's private sitting room and found several tightly bound bundles. Beneath them lay a handwritten memorandum, stating that her most sensitive correspondence must remain intact and ultimately pass to the heir responsible for carrying the monarchy into its next generation. The archivist read the instruction aloud with Charles and Anne present. The king looked toward his sister, but neither spoke. The phrase, "next generation," carried a meaning neither could escape. Elizabeth had not intended the collection to be permanently divided among her children. Anne reached toward one bundle marked with a date from her childhood, then stopped when the archivist reminded her that nothing could be removed. The Princess Royal withdrew her hand, but the hurt remained. She was not seeking control. She wanted the private voice of the mother she had served with absolute loyalty. The silence deepened when another envelope appeared beneath the memorandum. William's name was written across it in Elizabeth's unmistakable hand, yet a note ordered that it remain unopened until custodianship had been settled. Charles refused to let anyone break the seal. From that moment, the question was no longer whether the prince belonged at the center of the decision, but what his grandmother had intended him to understand. Anne asked her brother to promise that family memory would never become an instrument of power. He answered that unity required one guardian, not several competing owners. Days later, she learned he had prepared the sole heir order and demanded that he face her without advisors present. When brother and sister finally met, the argument was no longer about paper, archives, or protocol. It was about whether Charles had protected their mother's wishes or claimed the right to interpret them alone. Princess Anne entered the room without an aide, closed the door behind her, and refused the chair Charles offered. There would be no courtiers to soften her words, and no official minutes to reshape what followed. She had spent a lifetime defending the crown, but this time she was confronting the man who wore it. Charles had declared William the sole guardian of their mother's private voice, and Anne wanted to know whether duty had become an excuse for control. The Princess Royal rarely challenged royal hierarchy in public. As Elizabeth's only daughter, and one of the monarchy's most disciplined working figures, she had built her reputation on loyalty, endurance, and restraint. That made her anger impossible to dismiss. She placed a copied page of the late Queen's memorandum on the table and asked where their mother had specifically named William. The king replied that Elizabeth had identified the next generation heir in everything but title. Anne moved the offered chair aside. Interpretation is not the same as consent. Charles argued that the correspondence had to remain unified. Dividing it among siblings could invite selective leaks, competing versions of history, and private letters being used to defend individual reputations instead of protecting the crown. The correspondence meant the late monarch's personal letters and handwritten reflections, material capable of changing how decades of family conflict were understood. Anne did not raise her voice. That made the confrontation more severe. She reminded her brother that Elizabeth had belonged to them as a mother before she belonged to archives and historians. Her hand tightened around the page as she warned that shutting out the family would turn grief into resentment. Charles finally admitted what he feared. He did not trust their relatives to agree once the letters were opened. Old wounds had reopened over smaller matters, and he believed William alone possessed both the direct path to the throne and enough distance from Elizabeth's children to guard the collection without settling personal scores. Then Anne asked the question that broke his control. Was he protecting the monarchy or protecting Camilla from whatever their mother may have written? The monarch set down his pen sharply and insisted his wife had played no part in the decision. Anne held his gaze and said that if the prince was expected to carry such a burden, he deserved to hear every objection directly, not inherit a cleaned-up version of the dispute. Charles agreed to summon him. Neither sibling knew that the queen consort had already requested a separate review of the sealed material. As William prepared to enter a conflict he had never asked to lead, another struggle was unfolding quietly over who still possessed the power to challenge the king's decree. Royal power rarely announces itself with raised voices. It moves through signatures, locked cabinets, revised access lists, and instructions delivered so calmly that resistance appears improper. Charles's declaration had sounded personal, but its force came from an invisible structure already moving behind the palace walls. By the time the family began arguing, archivists, lawyers, and security officials had been given new orders, and one person discovered that her name had quietly disappeared from the chain of access. Custodianship required far more than the king's spoken approval. Archive permissions, inheritance instructions, security classifications, copying limits, and future publication authority all had to point toward William, leaving no gap through which another relative could later challenge his position. Custodianship meant legal responsibility for protecting, controlling, and eventually deciding access to the collection. Sir Jonathan Vale, the keeper of the royal archives, had served through Elizabeth's final years and believed her correspondence must survive as one complete historical body. Yet conviction did not make obedience painless. Inside the archive office, Jonathan removed names from the access register one by one. His hand stopped over Anne's authorization before he drew a line through it. He understood the command, but the act felt less like administration and more like separating a daughter from her mother's private voice. Camilla discovered the same hierarchy through a returned request. Her private secretary had asked to review letters concerning the early years of her relationship with Charles, only for the page to come back stamped, "Custodian approval required." The queen consort dismissed the secretary and remained alone, gripping the notice between both hands. Later, she confronted the king and asked for one limited exception. Charles refused. He warned that a single concession would weaken the entire arrangement. She answered that William could now judge her through the words of a woman who had once resisted her place in the family. Then Jonathan delivered a more dangerous revelation through a documented archive report. During Elizabeth's final year, selected correspondence had been copied under her direct instruction, but the destination was missing because the transfer entry had been handwritten and never digitized. William might control the main archive while someone else already possessed fragments of its most sensitive contents. The prince ordered no search and no accusations until the records were examined. Hours later, Anne received formal notice that her long-standing archive privilege had been suspended, while Camilla learned that every future request would pass through William personally. The decree had now moved beyond symbolism, and as doors began closing one by one, the family could finally feel the new hierarchy taking shape around them. The first true consequence arrived without ceremony. Princess Anne presented her identification at the archive entrance, as she had done many times before, expecting to review a small group of letters connected to her mother's charities. The official behind the desk did not meet her eyes. Her authorization had been withdrawn. In that quiet corridor, Charles's decision stopped being a constitutional theory and became something far more painful. A daughter being told she could no longer enter. Anne had previously been allowed limited access to correspondence linked to patronages, commemorative work, and historical records connected to Elizabeth's public life. The privilege had never given her control, but it had carried personal meaning. It was one of the last signs that the trust between mother and daughter had survived death. William's custodianship now changed every rule. No relative could inspect, copy, remove, quote, or approve publication of the late Queen's private letters without his written consent. Custodianship meant the legal duty to guard the collection and decide who could use it, but the new system also turned family memory into permission granted by one person. Anne accepted the refusal without argument. She returned the temporary pass, buttoned her coat, and asked the official for his name so he would understand she did not blame him. Only after she turned away did the hurt show. A sympathetic aide offered to contact William at once, but the Princess Royal refused. She would not beg her nephew for access she believed should never have been taken away. Pride protected her dignity, yet it also widened the distance between them. William learned of the incident during a briefing at Kensington Palace. The prince stopped the meeting and demanded to know why his aunt had not been warned privately. Anger broke through his control, because Charles's order had made him the visible gatekeeper of an exclusion he had never requested. Then Sir Jonathan Vail delivered a darker development through a documented archive report. One page had been torn from the index, covering letters written during the year Charles and Diana's marriage publicly collapsed. The missing sheet may have identified the documents copied under Elizabeth's direct instruction before the new restrictions began. Someone had acted early, and that meant control of the archive might already be incomplete. William refused to tighten the rules further. Instead, he left for Anne's residence without staff, prepared statements, or security briefings. He intended to offer her a path back into the collection, even if doing so meant challenging the structure his father had built. That private visit would become the moment the dispute changed direction, because William was about to choose between exercising inherited power and sharing the burden of truth. William arrived without a red box, an advisor, or the authority of a formal summons. Anne received him in a small sitting room where no royal portraits dominated the walls and no staff remained to witness their conversation. For the first time since Charles's decision, the future king and the late Queen's daughter faced one another without palace machinery between them. What passed across that room was not a negotiation for power, but an admission of grief. William spoke first. He told his aunt that Elizabeth had been his sovereign, mentor, and guide, but she had been Anne's mother long before any archive claimed her words. Sole custodianship, the legal responsibility for protecting and controlling the correspondence, could never mean sole emotional ownership of the woman behind it. The Princess Royal listened without interrupting. Then she admitted that the burden placed on him was heavier than the rest of the family wished to acknowledge. Reading every private judgment could force the prince to carry truths that could not be corrected, challenged, or answered by those who had written them. William reached inside his folder and placed an unsigned access proposal on the table. He slid it toward Anne slowly. The document restored supervised access to letters concerning her own life, service, and relationship with Elizabeth, while preserving the collection as one unified archive under his custody. She studied the page but did not touch the pen. Instead, Anne asked whether he feared Charles would consider the decision an act of defiance. William paused. Then he answered that honoring his grandmother required judgment, not blind obedience. If the king objected, he would accept responsibility himself. That answer broke the last barrier between them. Anne told her nephew that Elizabeth had trusted him because he could carry authority without needing to display it. Her anger softened. She finally signed, not as a defeated claimant, but as a daughter accepting a boundary that recognized both family and duty. Sir William then revealed through a documented archive briefing that one sealed envelope remained addressed directly to him in Elizabeth's handwriting. He had refused to open it until the dispute was settled, because he would not allow her final words to become ammunition in a family conflict. Anne looked at him carefully and said that such restraint might itself be the answer their mother had hoped to see. The prince returned to Buckingham Palace and informed Charles that his sister's access would be restored under supervision. The monarch studied his son before asking whether this was William's first decision as custodian. "Yes," he replied. By the next morning, the palace could no longer contain the story, and one newspaper image transformed a private family settlement into a national judgment on the future of the crown. The palace had prepared a restrained statement, but the public encountered the story through a far more powerful image. William was photographed leaving Buckingham Palace with the red custodianship file beneath his arm, while Charles stood faintly visible through an upper window. By sunrise, that single frame had become a symbol of transfer, trust, and generational change. Britain was no longer debating who owned the Queen's letters. It was debating who now carried her authority. Buckingham Palace confirmed that the prince had been designated sole custodian of Queen Elizabeth's private correspondence, while promising that access would be managed with respect for family privacy, historical preservation, and the dignity of the late sovereign. Custodianship meant legal control over how the papers were protected, reviewed, and eventually released. But the public heard something larger. The future king had been entrusted with the private memory of the past monarch. Commentators divided immediately. Some called it a natural act of succession, ensuring the archive remained complete as it passed toward the next reign. Others warned that William now possessed extraordinary power over how royal history might one day be told. The fictional morning edition of the Crown Chronicle printed the photograph beneath the headline, "The Queen's Final Trust." Outside Windsor Castle, visitors gathered around a newsstand, pointing toward the image while broadcasters reported from beyond the gates. At Kensington Palace, William saw the front page during breakfast and turned it face down. Catherine noticed his discomfort before he spoke. He told her there had been no victory, only a responsibility born from grief, suspicion, and a family forced to confront its hidden wounds. Camilla experienced the coverage differently. One broadcaster described him as guardian of Elizabeth's uncensored legacy, implying that even the king and queen now stood outside its authority. The queen consort switched off the television mid-sentence and remained silent. Public symbolism had made her exclusion impossible to conceal. Charles moved quickly to prevent that silence from becoming a national story. The monarch authorized a second statement, confirming that direct family members could receive supervised personal access at William's discretion. The announcement validated the arrangement made with Anne, and showed that the king accepted his son's independent judgment, rather than treating it as rebellion. The storm began to settle, but one sealed answer remained. William returned to the archive as the Princess Royal joined Charles nearby, and Catherine waited outside. The prince lifted Elizabeth's envelope and broke the seal at last. The last word would not belong to the newspapers, the courtiers, or even Charles. It would belong to the woman whose private voice had caused the palace to confront what succession was truly meant to preserve. William opened the envelope slowly, not because he feared a secret, but because he understood that this was the last private instruction his grandmother would ever give him. Charles stood several feet away, carrying the silence of a son. Anne watched with the guarded emotion of a daughter who had fought to remain connected to her mother. When William began to read, the room discovered that Elizabeth's final concern had never been ownership. It had been character. The prince had chosen to open the letter with the king and the Princess Royal present, proving that custodianship did not require emotional isolation. Custodianship meant the duty to protect and control access to the correspondence. Catherine remained close as support, while Camilla had been assured that material concerning her would be handled with dignity. William read the late Queen's instruction aloud. Her words warned that private correspondence must never become a weapon, prize, or shield for reputation. She charged the future sovereign to preserve truth, while showing mercy toward those who lived through it. Charles closed his eyes when the letter declared that leadership required protecting history without punishing the living. The monarch understood that naming one guardian had never endorsed secrecy or control. It tested whether authority could be exercised compassionately. William confirmed Anne's permanent supervised access to letters involving her life, service, and bond with Elizabeth. She accepted that the collection must remain whole, and said she no longer viewed the arrangement as exclusion, but protection against fragmentation. Camilla received fairness without control. The prince approved a process allowing the queen consort to review correspondence affecting her before any historical release, but she gained no right to remove, rewrite, or suppress it. She accepted the boundary because it preserved dignity without erasing Elizabeth's authentic voice. William ordered every sealed letter catalogued as one complete collection, protected for a defined period, with rules applying equally to everyone, including himself. He refused to read material unrelated to his duties, simply to satisfy curiosity. Charles's decision had done more than identify an heir to Elizabeth's private words. It revealed why William was ready to carry them. The crown's deepest strength was not control over the past, but restraint in preserving it without exploiting old wounds. Charles accepted his son's independence. Anne regained trust. Camilla received justice without privilege, and Elizabeth's memory remained whole. And with the Queen's letter returned carefully to its envelope, the family finally understood that William had inherited far more than private words. He had inherited the moral weight of remembering them correctly. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.